You can also find our guide that we produced for the committee at that site. This training is both available to the public via Zoom link that has been provided, as well as on the Princeton Gerrymandering Project's YouTube page. And a recording and the materials will be posted on our website later this week. Our speakers tonight are Maureen Skowron of the University of New Mexico, who will be covering metrics regarding compactness and political boundary splits. We'll then hear from Hannah Whelan of the Princeton team, who will discuss racial fairness metrics. Next, we'll hear from Daryl DeFord of Washington State University, who will cover partisan fairness metrics. And then finally, we will hear from Ari Goldblum-Heltzner regarding measures for competitiveness. Maureen, I turn the floor to you, and I believe Sandra to share your slides. So.
Thank you. So the word gerrymander originated in Massachusetts in 1812. The practice is named after Elbridge Gerry, who was then the governor of Massachusetts, and he came up with this district that is on the next slide that has something likened to a salamander. So since then, we've associated gerrymandering with odd shapes, but that association doesn't always hold. New Mexico law does call for districts to be reasonably compact, but a compact shape is not a guarantee against gerrymandering. For one example, a congressional redistricting plan in Pennsylvania scored high on 5 different measures of compactness. But analysis showed that it actually had the same extreme partisan skew as the plan it was intended to replace. And odd shapes might be justified for reasons such as physical or political geography, or to unite a community of interest. Speaking of communities of interest, New Mexico doesn't have much hierarchy between its different redistricting criteria. Some experts recommend a hierarchy, and you might decide to come up with one on your own. The Brennan Center for Justice has model legislation on redistricting, and it actually doesn't recommend considering compactness at all. Communities of interest, for example, get a higher priority. But nonetheless, it does have some benefits. The main one being of which it makes it easier for voters, candidates, and elected officials to travel across the district to meet and communicate with each other. It also makes it easier for voters to know which district they're in. But no redistricting principle is perfect. Rules on compactness are correlated with less influence by minorities. Now, here's an overview of rules in different states. Legislative districts are required to be reasonably compact by 37 states, and congressional districts are required to be compact by 18 states. I have no idea why some states make different rules for different districts, but that's the way it is. Now, although most states have some requirement for compactness, few spell out how that should be determined. And in many states, rules on compactness and several other criteria must be followed only as much as is practicable. And New Mexico, for example, only calls for districts to be reasonably compact. So that's a judgment call. Some states do have somewhat more specific guide rules. For instance, in Arizona, the map drawers must start with a grid-like pattern, and districts must be geographically compact. California says lines shouldn't pass nearby population to encompass more distant population. In Colorado, state legislative districts must be as compact as possible based on total perimeter. Idaho only uses the eyeball test. It requires that districts not be oddly shaped. In Iowa, compactness between districts or plans is to be compared by either length-width compactness, the lower absolute value of the difference indicating more compactness, or perimeter, with a smaller perimeter indicating more compactness. In Maine, compact and contiguous districts in the state legislative context are defined as those that minimize impediments to travel. So for instance, if lakes or mountains are in the way, that's a consideration. In Michigan, that has a long and somewhat convoluted requirement. If there are multiple districts within a city or township, this must be as compact as possible measured by drawing a circle around the district and assessing the area within the circle within the landmass of the state. And that's compared to the part of the state that is not part of the district measured. And these rules appear to have moderate success in keeping districts compact more than something that's more loose and vague. So as you can see, there's different ways you can measure compactness. In fact, there's scholars have proposed more than 30, and they haven't necessarily settled on one, although some are more common. They do agree generally that more than one measure should be used, and you shouldn't make an absolute cutoff. But they can be categorized in a few different groups. We can proceed to the next slide here, please. So there's those that measure the smoothness, the contortion or indentation of the boundaries, and that also includes the perimeters. And then the next slide, and those that measure how far the district spreads out from its center. So since a long rectangle would be less compact. Oh, I think we skipped one. That's okay. And then we have population dispersion measures. Okay, and this is the Polsby-Popper method. This is one of the more common methods used. And this compares the district area to the area of a circle with the same perimeter. So if you take your perimeter and just stretch it out to a circle and compare those, and then the value closest to 1 means it's more compact. The Schwartzberg method compares the district perimeter, so that's the next slide, please, the district perimeter to the perimeter of a circle with the same area. And this also value closer to 0 is best. So you can see how there's some patterns among these different formulas. And then the next one, and next slide, please, is total perimeter. And for this, you would add up the perimeter of all the districts in one plan, and then you compare that to the total perimeter of all districts in another plan. And the smallest perimeter is the most compact. The advantage here is it's simple. So the public, who often doesn't have any kind of sophisticated mapping software, they can still rough this out and get a general calculation for this. And next slide, please. Okay. And so, okay, so this is the dispersed methods. So you just can see the long rectangle is more dispersed and less compact. And so then the next slide, we have the REOC method. And this compares the district area. On the next slide, please. The district area to the area of the smallest circle that encompasses the whole district. And this is, again, one of the more common measures. And a value closest to 1 is best. And then we'll go to the next slide, please. And this is a convex hull. So if you see the outline around the district, it's called a convex hull or a convex bounding polygon. Basically, you draw around the parts of the district that jut out if you had a rubber band, and you make something that encompasses the district, and you compare those two areas. And again, a value closest to 1 is best. And next slide, please. And then you get to the length and the width ratio. So you would divide the length by the width or vice versa, and the value closest to 1 is best. If you have the value of 1, then that means you have a square, and that's basically the next closest shape after a circle that's going to be pretty compact. And in the next slide, we'll talk about a couple of measures of population dispersion instead of just area. All right, a population circle, you draw a circle around the district, you compare the population within the district to the population in the circle. Again, value closest to 1 is best. And a polygon, population polygon, again, you draw the rubber band type shape and around the areas that jut out, and you compare this population among the two shapes, and the value closest to 1 is best. And so you have all these different measures and all these different tests and all these different numbers, and what do you do that? A couple of years ago, Michael McDonald in 2019 he proposed a predominance test as a compactness standard. And so this is, yeah, I have a slide for this. So the benefits are this identifies compactness violations in a way that could be used in a court. It can be used with any compactness measures, the ones I've talked about or the ones I haven't talked about. And it adapts to the geography of any given district. So to do this, first you would draw any mandatory districts required by the Voting Rights Act, along with any other required districts, lock those into place. And then your next step is to draw the rest of the state with the most compact redistricting plan you can come up with. And that's called the maximally compact comparison plan. That you use to compare against any other plans. And then for each challenge district, if you have any districts that look particularly odd and you want to evaluate them, you would identify the nearest district in the comparison plan that covers the same area. And you compare them, the two of them. If the challenge district is at least 50% less compact, in the comparison district, the challenge district is suspect, and you call for a remedial redistricting plan. Now we'll move on to talking about splitting political units. Now, New Mexico law does call for to take into consideration political and geographic boundaries, including the boundaries of Indian nations, tribes, and pueblos. So I'd like to point out a couple things about that sentence. First off, geographic boundaries are not just necessarily, say, mountains and rivers, but it can also include man-made boundaries, cultural geography, such as streets, for instance. And when you talk about Indian nations, you don't necessarily need to consider just the outside boundaries, but some of them also have subdivisions within. For example, the Navajo Nation has what it calls chapters. And then again, some experts recommend considering communities of interest above political subdivisions, although they're somewhat, sometimes they can be proxies, but not always. You can't take that for granted. Now, Daniel Bowen has found that districts that are more compact and respect various political subdivisions are more closely, people are recognize their representative more and they know more about their elected officials and they're more likely to have contact with them. Now, as far as rules in other states, it's somewhat similar to compactness. Many states have rules, but they often don't spell out the details. 42 states call for consideration of political boundaries when drawing legislative districts. 19 states call for the same with congressional districts. Besides the principle against splitting political units, some states, such as New Mexico, encourage following physical and other geographic boundaries. Now, if the type of political boundary is specified, they most often call for counties and cities, but it can be talked about smaller units such as precincts. And then again, the states are somewhat vague. They usually don't specify a preference between splitting fewer political units or splitting those units fewer times. Now, the exceptions are Maine and Michigan, which require that political units be split as little as possible. Now, consider in New Mexico, we have only 3 congressional districts. The Bernalillo County itself is split over all 3 districts. And Congressional District 1 encompasses all of Torrance County plus parts of 4 other counties. So it seems like political subdivisions wasn't a priority at that time. Now, besides counties and cities, you might also consider smaller units such as school districts or even school attendance zones. For instance, in Albuquerque, which is more populous, people often know their closest school. And that way your borders aren't arbitrary, but they align with something that they're familiar with. Or even zip code areas. Almost everybody knows their zip code. And it's not a political subdivision, but it is an administrative subdivision. And the more that district borders align with zip code areas, research has shown that people are more likely to recognize or contact their representative. And if you go on to the next slide, please. If you have any questions after today, I'd be glad to talk to you more. And my contact information is on the last slide. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maureen. And one quick question that Robert had in the chat was if you could remind everyone what the name of Michael McDonald's method was.
Oh, yes, that's the predominance method.
Okay, thanks so much.
Or the predominance test.
So now I am going to turn it over to Hannah, who's going to talk to us about racial fairness metrics.
All right. So let me go ahead and share my screen next. All right. So I'll go ahead and get started. And I wanted to make the slides nice and simple because I don't think anyone will disagree with me that this is definitely the most complicated one to try to talk about and put into a metric. So I'll give away the lead right at the beginning. But the idea with racial fairness metrics is that it's not really something that you can distill down into metrics. It's really something that you still have to think about very high level and do a lot of analysis to make sure that you're satisfying the requirements for the state. So that's where I think we should start, is the requirements of the state. In the New Mexico bill, provision 5 in section 8A, it says that plans in New Mexico must comport with the provisions of the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965. I know there was a whole entire presentation just about that, and federal constitution standards. And they summarize that this means that plans that dilute a protected minority's voting strength are unacceptable, and race may be considered in developing redistricting plans, but shall not be the predominant consideration. And it finishes with stating that traditional race-neutral districting principles shall not be subordinated due to racial considerations. So that's the language. I want to go back a little bit and talk about the Voting Rights Act again. So just as a refresher, the piece of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that we're still having to follow, it said as amended, and there's 2 sections of the Voting Rights Act. We're still left with section 2 that prohibits vote dilution and discriminatory intent and effect. So that's a really complicated, but luckily we were given a test from some cases. I think they were back in the 90s. I don't remember exactly, but we got the Jingles 3-factor test that asks a way to show that a district needs to be protected by the Voting Rights Act, and that if it was not drawn, the map would lead to vote dilution or have a discriminatory intent and effect. The way to show that a district needs to be drawn is to show that a minority group is sufficiently large and geographically compact. So that ties really to the size of the district. Obviously, in a congressional district, you have a very large population. It's going to be hard for smaller minority groups to be proven that they are sufficiently large and would have a large block of voting power in a district like that. But when you get down to state legislative districts, there's really some nuances to how you're going to be having to draw districts. The second test is that minority group politically cohesive. There's a lot of new research coming out showing that certain racial minorities are not necessarily voting in a cohesive block in the way that we've seen in the past, especially Hispanic groups. We're seeing it's harder to do the analysis to show that these minorities are going to vote in the same way. But it's not just enough to show that the minority group in this area is voting in a politically cohesive way. You also have to show that the majority group in that area votes also cohesively and for different candidates, so that if this district is not drawn, that majority group is going to continue to dominate the district and prevent any representation for this minority community. So that's the test. I know you went over it before, but I wanted to dive into it again, because that's exactly what's going to have to be satisfied in New Mexico. And it's a tough thing to think about. So how can we measure this with data? Well, the way that this is done, it's done with a technique called racially polarized voting analysis, where you're trying to show that these racial minorities are polarized in their voting patterns, and that it's polarized in the opposite way of the majority. The technique is called ecological inference, and there's a lot of tools out there for ecological inference. There's a group called the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering Group, and they just came out with a great new Python package called PyEI. So now that's something that that Daryl and Ari and I are all able to work with, because we all know Python. So that's putting the tools into the hands of more and more people, but it is really something that needs to be done with experts. The data sets that go into it and the interpretation of the results is complicated and really has a lot more to do with law than numbers, I'd say. But it uses a statistical technique called regression, where you try to look for connections between the racial compositions of areas and the voting results. And you can use statistics to prove that, because we have a secret ballot in this country, so we can't tell exactly how people are voting, but you can use statistics to show that it's very likely that one group is voting in a certain way. Like I said, the data sets were probably the hardest part, and I think that's definitely something to talk about for a second. With a lot of the stuff that goes into partisan fairness metrics, you're able to use a wide range of election results from the general election, but for racially polarized voting analysis, you often have to find primary election results, because that's really where elections are happening that can show the differences in opinions between a minority group and a majority. Because this even comes down to primaries, where two different groups that make up the same party might have different opinions. That those are still protected under the Voting Rights Act. So primary data is often a lot harder to get access to and not as cleaned as general data, which we're more used to using. So that's another one of the pieces that goes into this that's really hard. So there's definitely going to be a need here for hooking up with some experts in New Mexico, or maybe someone who works more nationally, to make sure that there's some type of racially polarized voting analysis done. Just to really quickly talk about what that's going to look like when you're thinking about drawing maps. The first step is going to be, satisfying that first Jingles criteria, which is trying to find some a minority group that's sizable and compact. That we just heard Maureen talking about compactness, so it's the same exact idea. This doesn't really pertain to a spread out group that in most precincts might only be 10% of the population. You're really looking for areas that are slightly polarized from the rest of the population and are in the range of about 30 to 60% of a district. And that's really just a rough guide, but that can help you think about the differences in a congressional map and a state Senate map, because 30 to 60% of a congressional district is very large, but for one of those other districts, it's not as much. And then to show that district works for the Jingles criteria, you're going to have to use ecological inference to show that that minority population votes for similar candidates and that the surrounding majority votes for an opposing candidate. And that's where you have to be clever about which elections you look at to show. But this is the breakdown of the Jingles criteria. This is as close to metrics as we can get. Does it satisfy the Jingles criteria or not? A couple of things to mention. I think that this does overlap with communities of interest often. I think by keeping documented communities of interest whole, that's going to be a way to already start looking for sizable and compact minorities. And another thing I wanted to dive into is just that last part in the language that said that traditional race neutral districting principles shall not be subordinated to racial considerations. I think that's very specific to New Mexico. There are some states we have here. I think this is District 4 in Illinois. And this was drawn, this is a district that was not a gerrymander, even though it looks so non-compact. And this was drawn to satisfy the Voting Rights Act to give minorities that lived on the north and south end of Chicago suburbs to put them into the same district and give them the opportunity to elect a candidate of choice. And I think it did really impact minority representation in Illinois. But I think given this language in New Mexico, it would be harder to put together something like this and justify it. So I think that language is in there specifically to make sure that a district looks a little bit more like the traditional compact and county split minimizing districts that we're used to. So that's everything for me. I wanted to keep it short because I know there's probably going to be a lot of questions about this one. So I'll turn it back to Adam.
Well, and Hannah, just before we get off of this, Lisa asked in the chat if you referred to quote unquote documented communities of interest, and I wondered if you could just speak for a minute about what you meant by that. So.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that I mean by that. One is that there's one really important first thing to do is to look at Native American communities. The census even keeps track of that, and that's one very the government documents that, and it's a way to put that on a layer on a map and try to see what's sizable and compact in this chamber that you're drawing. There's also tools like Representable and Districtor, and Dave's Redistricting app is now even allowing people to draw their communities of interest. So that's another thing that I meant is basically anything that you can put on a map and really start looking at with other layers, with population numbers underneath, to get a feel for what's going to be sizable and compact. That's just a hard thing to try to visualize.
Thank you for that. So now I believe I am turning it over to Daryl.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll also share my screen here. Oops, it's not working. There we go. I'm excited to be back in New Mexico, even if it's only virtually here. My wife and I lived in Las Cruces for a while. We got married. Always hope to return there eventually. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about partisan fairness metrics, and sort of as an outline, just talk a little bit about sort of why we might care about partisan fairness metrics, sort of what it means to talk about fairness in this context. Look at some examples of metrics that are out there that people are thinking about in this space, and then wrap up sort of with a very similar point to Hannah's about the kinds of data and analysis that sort of need to go into the process before we can even start sort of applying some of these functions and metrics that have been defined. So to start with, why are we talking about partisan fairness today? Well, it shows up in a couple of places in sort of the governing legislation here. It's starting out saying you're not allowed to use several different types of partisan data, incumbent addresses, voting histories to begin with during the line drawing process. But then also asking after sort of the plans have been generated, as part of the written report that goes along with each of the plans, some measure of partisan fairness needs to be evaluated on those. So there is a need to sort of understand what metrics are out there and what they're telling us applied to these district plans. And so a lot of times, at least sort of in the conversation around redistricting, a lot of times you'll hear people say things like, well, statewide party A got, 50 some percentage of the vote, but they only got, 42% of the seats or something like that. And that's sort of an implicit appeal to something like proportionality, right? That there should somehow be a really direct relationship between the percentage of votes that are received on the statewide and the percentage of seats that go to that. And that's is a sort of big talking point. It's a very intuitive notion of fairness, but it's not something that necessarily squares very well with our distributed system. It's not something that the courts have tended to view as like a favorable type of argument to point out proportionality, because our system doesn't ask for that. But it is sort of a thing that starts to occur to people, and it is something that helps us to start thinking about what do we mean when we talk about fair? What's a fair outcome in a partisan sense under our districted system? And so there's several different sort of extensions of that and ways to sort of more closely tie this notion of the votes that were received in each district and the partisan outcomes that are seen in terms of the number of seats. So I'll talk sort of briefly about those. One really natural sort of idea from the political science community is this idea of a winner's bonus, that there should be some reward in sort of the number of seats that are sort of accrue to a party for their percentage over 50%. So maybe a metric might sort of reward a score that gives maybe twice a winner's bonus. So if you win the race by 3%, you should expect to win the number of seats by something like 6%. There's also sort of a separate notion, again, that's been studied a lot by political scientists, of the idea of symmetry, that somehow the districting plan together with the vote outcomes should treat the parties equally if their sort of roles were reversed, or if sort of there was a shift in the underlying voting patterns, that there should be some symmetry there, some fairness in that sense. And we'll look at some specific concrete measures of that as well. When we're talking about gerrymandering detection specifically in districting plans, people will often talk about the idea of packing or cracking populations, whether that's sort of racial or demographic groups or partisan groups. The idea of packing is sort of, fitting in maybe a large proportion of one group together in a district. So they're sort of wasting a lot of votes there, getting a large percentage over 50%. Whereas cracking is sort of the opposite, maybe sort of splitting up a group so they have a bunch of districts that are like in the 46 or 47% range, and again, sort of a lot of wasted votes. And that's similar to, I think, some of the stuff that Ari is going to be talking about a little bit about competitiveness and sort of how those partisan targets fit in. But beyond these sort of notions that just work with sort of raw voting totals, we might also want to consider like the geography. What types of districts are it possible to build? What sort of constraints do we have placed on us by some of these compactness criteria that we're talking about earlier? And finally, for a lot of these metrics, the sort of allowed or permissible range of values that you might see aren't obvious at all. It's not necessarily the case that you can just sort of expect to hit numerical targets without doing a lot of sort of in-depth studying of the state and the political geography and how people are distributed around the state. And so each of these sort of ideas gives us a sense of how we might define a notion of fairness, how we might come up with a metric that can be used to capture this type of information. And there's a lot of them out there. So this has been a set problem that political scientists and others have studied for a long time. The recent sort of version of the HR1 bill that passed the House in March had some language that specified a bunch of different types of partisan metrics that you might consider, and left in this sort of not limited to language. So they were just giving a subset of the potential metrics. And so we'll talk about these a little bit. I just wanted to highlight that there is sort of a large collection of these out there that have been well studied and all sort of capturing different pieces of these notions of fairness that we might. And so I want to just start by giving a couple of slightly more formal definitions of a few of these that show up here. So in particular, the seats votes curve, something that comes up a lot, and also sort of some examples of this packing and cracking behavior. And so a seats vote curve starts with a graph, and we're going to sort of plot the vote percentage in the state along the x-axis, and the number or the percentage of the seats won by a party along the y-axis. So this starting point here is from the Colorado House of Representatives election in 2020. So this pink dot sort of represents along the x-axis the overall voting percentage, about 4%, advantage 54% for the Democratic Party, which got them, I believe, 4 out of the 7 seats, so a little over 50% of the seats. So that's marked with the pink dot there, and the green star just marks the 50-50, sort of where's halfway. And the idea of the seats votes curve is we're going to sort of imagine what if the election values, the vote totals in each of the districts, shifted in each direction for the parties and get sort of a whole curve of outcomes extrapolated from this single point. And so that might look something like this in this case. And so this curve is sort of common to a lot of the measures that are put in place. You know, the partisan symmetry measures are looking at how symmetric is this curve if you sort of rotate it around the 50-50 point. And some of the other metrics that we're going to talk about are sort of also derived from this as well. I'll also just show you here, so this is what the curve looks like for Utah. So the starting point is further away from 50-50, sort of the baseline skew in the state is not quite as close to a 50-50 election as it was in Colorado. But here, if we extend this curve out, we notice that the curve itself goes through that 50-50 point. And so this scores pretty well on some of these partisan metrics that are defined in terms of this curve. The second thing I just wanted to mention was this idea of packing and cracking. So here I've got in the top the congressional districts in Pennsylvania displayed along the x-axis and the corresponding sort of Democratic voting percentages along the y-axis. And it's sort of this gap here that you can see that sort of crosses the 50% line that you know the group over at Duke, for example, likes to call the signature of gerrymandering. I think that there's something you might think about these districts sort of over this line as being packed, and the ones that are sort of been placed here correspondingly under the line as maybe being cracked districts. Where the representation is not happening. And this doesn't just happen for partisan intent, it also is a concern for racial gerrymandering. So the bottom plot is showing the Virginia House of Delegates plan that was eventually ruled unconstitutional. And again, notice there's this sort of large gap here between a bunch of districts that are all up at 55%, then a big drop down to the next district. So again, some packing and cracking of districts there. So that's sort of a visual representation of what that means and what people are thinking about when they talk about that. And so the types of metrics then can start from very simple comparisons that just look at these sort of seats versus votes numbers, appeal to proportionality, can get a little bit more refined to talk about things that are derived from this vector of percentages, one per district. So that's things like the mean median score and partisan bias, which you can evaluate in terms of the horizontal and vertical distance, respectively, from that seats votes curve to that green star, the 50-50 point. This also includes things like the efficiency gap that are trying to explicitly capture the number of wasted votes between the two parties and sort of how those are distributed between the districts. There's more refined measurements to try to incorporate some geography, things like the partisan dislocation or the geometric that have been introduced sort of recently. And then finally, a lot of sort of interest in the last few years has been driven by ensemble methods, building large collections of plans intended to sort of satisfy the main constraints in the state, and using those as a baseline to compare against in terms of the enacted values that you're seeing or the plans that are under consideration when you look at these metrics. And one nice thing there is that if you've sort of constructed this large collection of plans to evaluate, that gives you a sense of what a reasonable or a normal range of those metric values might be. And one reason that that's really important, and one reason that this sort of modeling is very helpful, is those metric values can vary quite a bit from state to state. So let me show you just a brief example of that here. So on the left, I've got some mean median scores across a large ensemble of plans from Virginia. On the right, some mean median scores across a large ensemble of plans for Pennsylvania. And if you sort of look at the x-axis here, the ones in Virginia are sort of pretty close to being centered at 0, sort of having a small value there. And so if you've taken that as your definition of fairness, then a generic plan here sort of satisfies that pretty well. On the other hand, just because of the political geography, the way people are just sort of distributed across the state, a plan with a score of 0 under this metric is actually kind of an outlier in Pennsylvania. It requires it may be a little bit more careful selection of the boundaries, or is certainly not something that you might expect to construct just by accident, sort of generically. And so this type of analysis is really helpful, because if you sort of said, well, here's the metric I care about, what sort of values are good? Well, it depends a lot on your state. It depends a lot on the kind of analysis that you can do to try to understand how people are distributed. And so on sort of that note, a similar question for all of these that has to be raised is, how do you actually decide what elections to use to do this analysis? Much like Hannah pointed out in terms of the RPV analysis, this is somewhere that requires some thoughtful local knowledge about sort of the elections, and were there special factors in play in some of them, how you deal with popular incumbents, how do you aggregate those elections together, how do you decide to turn sort of historical data into a model for forecasting future elections in order to sort of apply these tools and metrics themselves. And so there's sort of a lot of thoughtful analysis that's required before selecting one of these metrics, not just in terms of the metric itself and how it sort of is implicitly defining fairness, but also sort of how the inputs that go into that are going to affect the final result. So thanks a lot. And here are the current districting plans in sort of technical.
Thanks so much, Daryl. That was really helpful. I am going to turn it over to Ari, who I think is going to kind of pick right up on that topic and talk to us about competitiveness.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ari Goldman-Pelsner, and I'll be talking about competitiveness, which is very much related to the partisan fairness that Daryl was talking about. Let me first just give a little definition of competitiveness. What do we really mean by this? So competitive district is really one in which Democrats, Republicans, and independents all have a reasonable chance of winning, and no party has a significant advantage. And we sort of look at that as a perfect 50-50 election would be a competitive one, and we give it a little bit of a leeway there depending on the election. We tend to think of competitive elections having, let's say, a 7-point or perhaps a 10-point band around 50%. So 7 points would be 46.5 to 53.5%. Of the vote share, the parties are winning. So Democrats and Republicans or independents are winning those vote shares, and it's competitive. One other way to think about this is a visual on the right here, in which here we have plotted sorted district by district Democratic vote shares, where on the left side is the least Democratic vote share district, and on the right, the most Democratic vote share. And we find that these districts here on the bottom left are solidly Republican districts because the Democratic vote share is high 30s, low 40s. The ones on the top right here are solidly Democratic, vote shares around 70, 80, 90%. And these are the districts here that are in this competitive zone in which the vote shares are between 46.5 and 53.5%. Particularly important is that when districting plans are sort of avoiding this zone, that could be an indication that there is a reason to or a manipulation of the lines so that we're having an uncompetitive map. So that brings us sort of the question of why competitiveness at all? Competitiveness is not explicitly talked about in the New Mexico redistricting rules. Why do we care about competitiveness then? Well, I think there are a number of reasons. One is that gerrymandered maps are often, as I stated, produce many uncompetitive districts. And that happens by, as Daryl was saying, packing voters of the opposition party into a few select districts and cracking them into other districts that give solid wins to their own party, effectively guaranteeing wins for all districts and not having any competitive ones. There's also a sense that having competitive elections could limit incumbency protections, in which politicians have to actually campaign for their seats, and potentially could reduce opportunities for partisan gerrymandering, as I mentioned. There's also continuing research on this, but having competitive elections could also increase responsiveness of politicians to their voters. since they have to, again, campaign to get reelected and may hold politicians more accountable. Another important consideration, I know this was discussed in an earlier training, that the New Mexico Center for Social Policy did a survey and found that a plurality of New Mexican voters, 47%, wanted districts that were politically competitive. That was an important part of having fair districting, that the results of these elections were not sort of set in stone or preordained, and in fact, the politicians and candidates had to compete for voters. I'll also just mention that a single map can fulfill multiple priorities. So even though competitiveness is not necessarily written into the redistricting rules, a map can simultaneously fulfill federal guidelines for redistricting, New Mexico specific rules, and then also some other priorities like having competitive districts. And to get to another question of, well, where would the competitiveness, or where would thinking about competitiveness come up during this process? Well, one would be during the citizen public comment period, which citizens might bring comments about competitiveness. They might ask for more competitive elections. Like I showed in the previous slide, competitiveness is an important quality in districts, and they may bring analysis like what I will talk about in the next slide. And so it's important to understand how we might determine what a competitive map is and what an uncompetitive map is. Another thing to think about is in the evaluation stage, as Daryl had mentioned, there's a written evaluation where you have to measure some partisan fairness metric, and perhaps competitiveness could fit into that as well, since a lot of similar analysis goes into determining what a competitive map is. Now I'll briefly describe, so there are not, unfortunately, as many competitiveness measures as sort of partisan fairness ones in the literature that Daryl talked about, but one references something called the ensemble method, which Daryl mentioned, where we produce a large set of alternative redistricting plans that comport with New Mexico's redistricting criteria, such as compactness and preserving administrative political boundaries and ensuring minority representation and so on. And with those large number of maps, one can then calculate the number of competitive districts in each of those plans and visualize that distribution. So I've given an example on the right here of the number of competitive districts that will come out of an ensemble of maps here. I think there are about 500,000 maps in this ensemble, and you can see that a number of the maps had 6 competitive, 7 competitive, 8, and so on. Then once you have that distribution, you can then compare your proposed plan to that distribution to see if it's an outlier. And we're seeing here that perhaps it is an outlier, since this number, the actual number of competitive districts for this example was at 2, which seems like an outlier compared to the rest of the bulk of this distribution. And then we would find that this is sort of an uncompetitive map that sort of artificially creates these districts that you wouldn't have expected to see, given the political geography and landscape of New Mexico and following sort of the redistricting criteria that Mexico puts forth. With that, I will conclude.
Great, thanks, Ari. With that, I think this would be a great time to open it up to the committee for any questions that they have.
So this is Lisa Curtis. I had a question. I wrote it in the chat. I'm trying to understand competitiveness sort of in our current environment, whether you're talking about competitiveness in different strains of the same political party, or if you're only talking about Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this presentation was about competitiveness between the parties, so in the general election. However, you could do some similar type of analysis in a primary to determine that, though you would need primary data for that. And as Hannah mentioned, that is a little bit harder to come by.
Yeah, I think it is generally accepted that competitiveness just means, between the two parties. And so that poll was probably asking about that.
Okay, I mean, I hate to keep blowing the same horn, but I mean, New Mexico has a history and we don't have standard East Coast Democratic principles. Okay, as everybody from here knows, right? Our Democrats tend to be heavy Second Amendment and anti-abortion many times. Okay, I mean, so that's why I'm trying to figure out, is there any poll that talks about the difference, and any poll at all that we would be able to look at legitimately, all right, that would give us some instruction about the competitiveness issue within the Democratic Party. And then, we have this heavy number of independents versus maybe I'm just going to be straightforward because that's how I am about things, okay, or the Trump Republicans, all right, which is a very different set of people, right? The more moderate Republicans versus maybe the Trump Republicans. I mean, do we have any information that we might be able to use to understand the differences inside the party from any source that you all are aware of, just for this competitiveness issue?
If I could jump in, I think Gabe Sanchez, who gave the presentation last week, I think he would be the person to ask that question. If he doesn't know the answer, he would know where to point. If you're thinking specifically about New Mexico, he would be a great resource for that.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And the only thing I was going to add is I think that the public comment period is also a unique opportunity to try to put that out there and see what type of feedback you get from concerned citizens.
If I could, I'm very intrigued by this competitiveness measure, because it's something that is not in our redistricting act, but it is something that I personally feel is important for our democracy, is to have more competitive districts. And I'm not alone, because the survey that we heard about from Gabe Sanchez last week indicated that it's important to voters. But as I'm thinking about the competitiveness, which must, by law, be subordinate to first the Voting Rights Act, and then in New Mexico's redistricting act, it has to be subordinate to communities of interest. And when you've applied the Voting Rights Act, and then you've taken in the input from people around the state, and you've tried to preserve those communities of interest, you've now packed people in a partisan manner, because people are tending to cluster more and more along political ideologies. It's true in New Mexico, and it's true throughout the state. So I wonder how, if we have room to consider competitive districts, I'm wondering how many possible competitive districts there would be, what fraction of our districts, whether we're talking about just our 3 congressional districts or our 70 House districts. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of room to even create competitive districts. Am I thinking about this correctly, Ari, or any of our other experts?
So I think that's a really great point. And I think one of the advantages of this ensemble method is that it takes these redistricting rules and the political geography of New Mexico into account, and is not a test that's telling you that you need X number of competitive districts. Rather, it's saying, given all those rules, how many competitive districts would we expect? And perhaps given the rules, we might expect not too many of them. But that's something you'd have to sort of figure out by running the algorithm and seeing what happens. But you might be surprised. You might find that there are maps that follow all the rules and then still have competitive districts in that subordinate manner that you had mentioned. I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah, and if I can add one thing, I think there are a couple of things that prevent that from happening terribly. I think a lot of the partisan fairness metrics that Daryl was talking about are sort of also looking for when there might be overpacking happening. And I didn't really touch on it too much, but I'm glad that Daryl defined the packing and cracking, because that's also an issue when it comes to racial fairness, where I said 30 to 60%, and I didn't go too in depth, but it's really hard to try to justify a Voting Rights Act district of more than like 65% Black voting age population. In certain areas, that's really considered heavily packed and would probably end up in a legal challenge in that way. So it's really a balancing act where the distribution that you saw in Ari's histogram is sort of what you end up seeing, where there's always a certain number of districts that are very Republican and a certain number of districts that are very Democratic, but there's always going to be a few that end up in that competitive range if a map was drawn without the goal from the very beginning to make sure to avoid competitive districts.
Thank you.
Joaquin, I think you had a question and I want to make sure you have a chance.
Thanks, Adam. So part of it got answered already with Robert's question, which I really appreciate. And I'm also very interested in I'm a recovering civil engineer. So I'm interested in how you do things structurally that can lead to or contribute to, democratic practices on the ground. So I'm attracted to the idea of competitiveness, but then I also hear from more experienced but also cynical political operatives that say that competitiveness is what happens when one party becomes the minority party, and all of a sudden competitiveness becomes important. So I think there's some some tensions there, and I don't know that'll be a driving factor in what we're dealing with, but I am curious to learn more, and just especially along the lines as Robert laid it out. So I appreciate that. But my question is, and I'm sorry that I missed the session last week, where I feel a little bit of a confusion around is we're not supposed to look at historical data in terms of voting, but then we're supposed to take it into account in terms of racial fairness. And then if we do get to competitiveness in terms of looking at it for competitiveness, so how do we square that? How do we deal with that?
So my sense, I can try to tackle this, and then if somebody else wants to jump in. There is that one of the hopes is that you sort of have avoided what is kind of known, I guess, in the political science side is like unintentional gerrymandering, right? So if you have gone through this process, you followed it as it's laid out through the legislative text there, you haven't sort of turned on the filters with the the voter file or with the sort of historical voting data, and have built maps that seem like they are quite good under all of the measures that you're sort of required to follow. Then that last step of having to evaluate this as part of the report, I think is sort of a check against ending up in the situation where just by following those rules and sort of going along with Robert's question earlier, that you've ended up sort of doing a bunch of unintentional packing, or sort of ended up with a map that seems like a real outlier, very skewed under these metrics. And I think that the goal there is to sort of keep that from happening without intent, and that once you've sort of looked at those, and this is part of why I think it makes a lot of sense to think carefully about which metrics to use and how to use them sort of before you've done that evaluation, so you can evaluate the answers in light of the context that you've discussed beforehand, and not just say, okay, well, we got a score of minus 0.65, that's too bad, we're going to go tweak some things to make it happen, but can decide based on this output, we really feel like the decisions that we made justify this, or maybe we can go back and find some areas to change the plans or look at other alternatives that aren't going to score as poorly under the metrics that you've ended up with.
And I will also caveat, and recognizing that I'm an attorney, but I'm certainly not giving you all legal advice. So, but the consideration of partisan data does have certain places where you all can use it without falling afoul of the law, right? So, I mean, you can hire a consultant who can do the racialized polarized voting analysis for you, right? And they can look at the partisan data, present to you what the impact from a racial perspective would be. You all are not considering the partisan impact. You're just looking at the racial fairness, making sure that you're complying with the Voting Rights Act, for example. It's also, I mean, perfectly possible that the public in the process of providing comment to you all may reference either competitiveness or fairness in their comments as they're considering draft maps, right? And that's not you all going out and seeking that information. You're not considering the data. It's being presented to you as part of a public comment, and you certainly need to hear out what the public is saying to you about these issues. So I certainly don't want to ever advise you to do anything that will fall afoul of the law, but I do want you to know that there are ways for you to consider this information in a way that's not going to result in you having problems, hopefully.
That's very, very helpful. Thank you. And along those lines, and it was off of something that Lisa said. So does competitiveness then, because the fastest growing, designation is people not declining or independent, does it then include not just Democratic, Republican, but does it include the number of independents as well?
Yeah, I think that it definitely could include that. You would have to, I think, alter exactly the statistic that you're looking at, and just make sure you're defining competitive in the way that you want to. But using that ensemble method that I described, you would be able to take that into account and consider how independents are voting, I believe.
Thank you.
I just want to thank Princeton for the programs that you put on for us, and the wonderful experts that you brought from in New Mexico and outside of New Mexico. It's been very informative for me. And the experiment with not looking at partisan data as we draw maps, we're looking at it after we adopt, is going to be fascinating. Thanks again.
Well, and thank you all, for the members of the committee, for making time to hear from us and to really be so engaged in all of these. It's been really great for us, and to the extent that we can continue to provide you all resources or answer any questions, you have my contact information. I'm happy to send you the contact information for any of the speakers if you wanted to follow up with them on anything specific. They have all expressed a willingness to answer questions, and I'm sure that will continue to be the case. We're all invested in your success and want it to be a good process. So.
I can tell you that I already asked my assistant to find Professor Sanchez at NMSU. All right, because obviously any information that we can have that is directly relevant to our state, we really need to know that. So if you're doing anything or sending us stuff, things like that, I think could be really important. So we just have a good understanding of what we should be considering for our state, for people that are paying attention here.
Yeah, it is.
We're not California. We're not at all. As I know, Daryl said that he spent time in Las Cruces, the most conflicted part of our state. Okay, I mean, it's an interesting problem we have to solve.
Yeah, it is such a local thing, and it really, I think maps get so much better when there's a group like you all thinking about all of these nuances. So we're really excited to answer these questions and hear about what you're thinking about.
Okay, well,
And I just want to give a final thank you to Hannah, because I've learned over the past few months so much about the 3 jingles prongs, but I really appreciated how you, for the first time I saw you laid out, well, how do you measure it? Okay, well, this one's, 30 to 60% of the census, and then the other 2, you're doing this ecological, I have it in my notes, but I just appreciated seeing that for the first time. That was very helpful.
And of course, it's always an oversimplification, but sometimes you
Sure.
need to simplify it a little just to understand.
Yeah. Absolutely.
okay. Well, thank you all so much. Again, feel
you
free
all.
to reach out to me, and best of luck to you all. We're here to support you, and we're watching. So
Yeah, good luck, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night. Nice
Bye.
to see you all.
yeah, you too.
Bye.
Okay. Thanks, Sandra.